Hey guys, All in Crypto here, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for another YouTube video. We have a very special guest on the show today, guys. We have Derek Yu, the founder of purestake, the company behind Moonbeam, the second only parachain to launch on Polkadot, with I believe $35 million given over to the auction, roughly around about $1.4 billion at the time, and of course MoonRiver, the kusama equivalent. So welcome, Derek. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, the pleasure is really all mine. As a kind of fan of the project and someone that's been following it for a long time, really excited to get in and ask you some questions. So could we maybe start with a bit of an introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the CEO of purestake, which is the primary contributor to the protocol, like the Moonbeam protocol, doing a lot of the protocol development around Moonbeam. My background has really been, I've been my whole career working on software. Spent a long stint in just regular Web 2, building SaaS companies. But yeah, started off, even I'm old enough to have started off like in the first internet wave, so I kind of date myself a little bit there. But I do see a lot of parallels actually between back then when I started my career and now, which maybe we can get into, because I do think that's that there are like a lot of interesting parallels with the internet, like when it first came out. But yeah, been building software. Like I spent a long stint building up a regular kind of B2B SaaS company. So I spent a good 12, 13 years building up a company called Fuse that I had started. That was at its height about a 700-person company, so it achieved some scale. And so that's where I learned a lot. I learned a lot about, first you're a bootstrapped startup, then you're getting VC financing, then you're figuring out, how to scale like a business. And so I call it this like book of many chapters, where I learned a lot of things about how to, build, both software, but also companies. And so now I've taken a lot of those experiences and moved them into the Web3 space. A lot of that thinking has gone into, purestake, and then how we've gone about working on the Moonbeam as a project.
Yeah, it's one thing that I noticed that really stood out about you is you do have a experience in the Web 2 space. A lot of Web 3 sort of founders don't really have that experience, not only in Web 2, but actually building a company that's sort of technology based. So I'm sure that's been very useful transitioning to Web 3.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think there's definitely a lot of lessons that are equally applicable from Web 2 to Web 3, and that I think that like actually gives. I feel like I have a leg up just having gone through that experience. On the other hand, there's things that are totally like opposite and different, right? Like where the thinking is totally different. So I'll give you an example. So for an example, I think a couple of things that strike me in Web 3 is, particularly I'd say around the kind of go to market and like thinking about like your customers, even using the word customers, right? So using the word customers, that's a Web 2 thing. And I think sometimes Web 3 folks don't even like using that kind of terminology. But I think it's helpful because you're trying to build a product and get people to use it. You really should be quite focused on like, who are those people? And very simple things. Talk to those people. Ask them like what it is working, what's not working. What are the pain points? That's stuff that a normal Web 2 company does. And sometimes, frankly, it doesn't even happen in like Web 3, right? People just don't even do these like very basic things to figure out like, well, what is it that's, how do I make my product better, basically? How do I get more people to use it? And so that's an example of something that is obviously, very applicable. Another example I'd say is UX, right? Where I blow people's minds when I describe, for the SaaS product I worked on, I'd say a good maybe third of the product team was devoted to UX. I mean, there was a design team, there was like, people doing like UX research. There was, a lot of effort went into creating user experience. That's why when you use Web 2 products, they're good. Like, like people like to use them because a huge amount of energy has gone into like making the usability good. And then when I look at the constitution of a normal Web 3 protocol team, I mean, you're lucky if you have one designer. Usually it's outsourced. Like, let's go to Upwork and let's hire a designer so it doesn't look shitty. It's like, yeah, like it's not like a third of the team. And so I think, I'm always trying to explain that, look, like you need to make investments into this stuff if you want it to be, to work well. Now, I mean, give you an example of something that is upside down is like, you think about as a Web 2 founder, you start a company, there's like equity in that company, and then it's always this fight where you're like, I want to kind of keep as much for the founding team, as much equity as I can. And then it's going to get diluted when you're raising funds, but you're trying to minimize the dilution so that like in the end, if you get to like an IPO or some kind of event, a buyout, that, there'll be like a value realization for the founding team. That's pretty different. In Web 3, you can't think like that. Like, the Web 3, especially for a protocol, the question is like, how do I give it away, and how do I get tokens into the hands of the people who are going to like help the protocol like make it successful. Like, so it's a very like different like style of thinking that's like, I think some Web 2 people have a hard time, when it comes to some of these things that I call are kind of upside down, like when you're trying to build a decentralized protocol.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think with what's happening with blockchain, and we've always sort of, and I'm sure you're of the sort of thinking that it's a real technological revolution that's going on here. And actually, it's one of the easier ones to understand in some regards because we have the internet. However, there are definitely differences, and I think that's very, very interesting. And I'm sure, like you said, that there's probably some massive challenges to being Web3 in opposition with Web2. Shall we move on to Moonbeam? And what are your sort of, if you could maybe give a broad overview of what Moonbeam is? I know there's many moving parts to it, and I'm sure we can break them down. But could you give an overview of what Moonbeam actually is?
Sure. Yeah. So Moonbeam is a smart contract platform. So it's a developer platform, developer infrastructure, smart contract platform. But really, it focused on and specializes in cross-chain use cases. So that's how it distinguishes itself from like other like L1 smart contract platforms out in the market. And I think if I go back to like what was the original idea or the vision, the coming from this like Web 2 space into Web 3, even from early on, this was back in the beginning of 2019 when I entered into the space, it was clear to me that there was going to be many blockchains, and that the ability to connect or kind of be able to communicate between these blockchains, just like when you have computers in the regular world and you network like between them, that was the critical capability. And so the idea was to build something that would kind of be native and kind of work in this environment where there's many blockchains, and that that there would be all of these different ways of connecting or kind of sending messages between these like different blockchains. And yeah, I think that's what led down the path of Polkadot, because Polkadot also has this kind of a tool set and ability to create your own chain, which we want to do, but it also has some points of view and some answers to this question of how different chains communicate with each other, namely this XCM technology. So those were two big motivations for what led us down this path. And I think, yeah, the other big kind of thing around Moonbeam that was well known for is we did do a full EVM implementation, like using Substrate, which is the kind of the technology toolkit that folks use in the Polkadot ecosystem for building things. And so I think that sometimes Moonbeam is known as the EVM of Polkadot. And I would say this is again back to this like Web 2, Web 3 thing, because when I first looked at it, you're going to try to get developers to come and build something on your platform. So the question is pretty simple: is like, well, where are they? What are they using? Like, what are they familiar with? Where are the tools? And for me, at that point, it was quite obvious that like the tools in and around this EVM technology stack, were like way in advance of anything else, right? And that's where most of the developers are. That's what they know already. If you want like tools and infrastructure, wallets, other things, like that's where the users are as well. And so that informed that decision of like, hey, we want to do this, make a platform that is compatible with the EVM.
Yeah, I have certainly heard Moonbeam be called the sort of EVM chain of Polkadot. And I think there's many benefits with EVM. You mentioned the tooling, you guys are integrated, and you could use MetaMask to sort of interact with Moonbeam. I just want to go back to something that you said about users. I've got many friends in the sort of traditional financial space, and they still look at crypto with this massive skepticism. And I think in some ways it's very warranted, in others not so much. One question I always get is, what is the value of a cryptocurrency? Why is it valuable? Potentially there's nothing intrinsic or something like that. And what they don't understand, many of these people are invested in things like Amazon or these other sort of web products. And the value for crypto for me has always been the users. So I think EVM and sort of using that is a very smart move from a sort of outsider looking in. And also what you said at the start about, really looking at UX and user experience and trying to improve it. I think that's an amazing approach to sort of take and bring over to the Web3 space. So how did
I'll comment on those comments a little bit, because I have thought about these questions as well quite a bit. And so the question is like, well, why is something valuable? I do think there's a couple different ways of answering that. In one way, and I see this these days, is that even for protocols, people are getting much more discerning when they're looking at different like protocol token economic models. And so it's not directly analogous to use like traditional company evaluation frameworks or metrics, but people are at least, like when I started, people were not talking about this at all. Now, if I talk to people, there's people are saying things like, okay, well, what is like the protocol revenue? Like, how does this become sustainable, without like, token issuances or other inflation or other things like happening? Like, what is the actual value transfer from the user, the demand coming into the protocol versus the supply, like the node runners and other people that are providing the service? So I think people are getting definitely more sophisticated about this, especially in the bear now, right? Where there's no like speculative, like, or the speculative value is like quite diminished. So I think that's, one trend I'm seeing. But on the other side, there is like this more philosophical point of just like what makes anything valuable. And I think that, when you talk to some finance people that have spent their lives building these like bottom-up models of like, discounted cash flows and, other things, they get kind of upset with crypto because they're like, there is no like actual like underpinning. But I do think that even if you leave this protocol revenue things aside, there is something to the idea that, something is valuable because there's a community of people that think it's valuable. And this is upsetting for like a finance person, but I think that there's a lot of things in life that are like that they are what they are because there's a community of people that like have some shared set of beliefs around them. And crypto for me is the purest expression of this, right? It's like, it's something, if you have like some of these larger projects that have huge like communities around them, they're valuable, right? So I think you get questions of like, what makes something art or not art, or like, there's all these questions in life that I think take a similar form where it's hard to define it like, in like a precise or kind of mathematical way, and it's more about this like shared set of beliefs in this community kind of thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think it was Adam Smith who said that money is really just an ideology. And isn't money itself just valuable because we think it is? When you really sort of strip it all back. But you're right, there's huge power in community and the sort of social network effect that comes with it. How did you sort of, what was the thought process for you to kind of go, right, I want to build Moonbeam, I want to build MoonRiver? How did Moonbeam come about?
Yeah, so I mean, there was a bit of a journey. So I'd say that I was in this Web2 company. The thing that got me into Web3 is my co-founder from that company left to start a crypto project. So he went on to found the L1 Algorand, which is based here in Boston, like I am. And so that's what got me initially interested then, because I'd worked with this guy Steve for many years, Steve Kokinos. So once I came in, we started off doing like infrastructure work to kind of learn, and there's just a lot to learn like in the Web3 space when you're coming in. So I think as we started with this like infrastructure services, Node, RPC, like these different kind of lower level like infrastructure services we were providing as a service. I think that's when I kind of understood, look, like kind of moving up the stack to create like a protocol, that's like definitely like more interesting and kind of would be a way to like focus into like a particular domain and to do something perhaps more meaningful, right? Like it's pretty crowded when it comes to these like infrastructure service providers, node operators, these kinds of things, or validators, service providers. But obviously it's like a much larger challenge to create like an actual protocol that is being used for development. And so that was one motivation, was to find that thing. And then, as I mentioned before, it was just quite clear to me that there's a new style of approach needed in an environment that is like has many chains in it, many specialized chains potentially, and that there need to be kind of solutions that would help coordinate activity among these chains. And back in 2019 or 2020, like the beginning of 2020 when we started the project, this thing on there being many EVMs. I mean, there's still, I would say, consensus at that time was more that, hey, it's mostly Ethereum and that's kind of it. And then there's like these sideshows elsewhere. So I think that was, in retrospect, those were pretty good bets to make at that time, because then obviously, BNB chain and other things started happening that made it clear that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of like chains and a lot of EVMs, out there.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that really drew me, I guess, to the Polkadot ecosystem and also the Cosmos ecosystem is, I've kind of watched the evolution of cryptocurrency or blockchain, and how you've went from sort of Bitcoin to Ethereum, and now everyone's sort of looking to move to proof of stake. But actually, for me, what Polkadot have done and Cosmos is they've came up with a whole different way of doing blockchain. Instead of just providing a sort of base layer that you could build dApps upon, they're providing a base layer that you can build your own layer one upon, and it comes with a whole list of benefits like XCM, or whether it be IBC or whatever it is, these things you can implement and sort of tackle and make the project that you're building on top of these unique through being built on them. And I really feel like, is that a fair statement to say what Moonbeam is sort of trying to do?
Well, I think that's right in a sense. So I do agree with you that the historical arc, you started off with these like application specific chains like Bitcoin and like, and others. Then the big innovation was, well, let's create a chain that kind of offers this generic development capability like Ethereum. And now I think the pendulum is swinging back like towards more like, let's call it like frameworks that allow you to create like your own like app chains, right? Is a term that you hear a lot. So Cosmos SDK fits into this, Substrate fits into this. I think we're a little bit of a hybrid where we've obviously used one of those frameworks to create Moonbeam, but Moonbeam itself is this like developer platform. So it's a little bit of kind of 1 foot in one camp, 1 foot in the other camp. But I am like extremely bullish on this idea of making it easier to create like your own chain. I mean, the mental model I have is the history of computing, right? So in the history of computing, if you go back way back when, there was very few of these things. They were super expensive and super hard to make. So you had these small number of computers. They were highly valuable though, and then there was all these features to time slice them, right? So that people could share this like resource, or you had to get up in the middle of the night, like your slot to use a computer was like from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., whatever it was, right? So people were doing this, and then of course over time, it gets just easier and easier to like make computers. So now like you're wearing like 5 of them or whatever it is now, right? So like it's so I think, and they're specialized right into different use cases. So I see a similar evolution where we're still in this era where there's like they're very expensive, they're very difficult to make, there's very few of them, but I'm extremely confident there's going to be more and more of these things specializing, occupying all sorts of niches, just like computers like have been. And by the way, I think there's an analogy there too with networking where in the beginning, computers were just these standalone things. You brought the work to them, you did like whatever it was, and then you would like leave with the results. But think about like how networking changed all that, right? Where when you can have computers talk to each other, that enabled the internet, that enabled multi-server architectures, like all sorts of different like things that have been unlocked by being able to network the computers together. And I see the same, whatever they say, like history, like rhymes doesn't repeat. So there's some kind of rhyming pattern here with blockchains where there's going to be many of them, and this ability to network them will lead to all sorts of new application architectures and new kinds of things.
Yeah, the possibilities I believe really will become endless when that is finally enabled. And I think this is one of the major problems that we're now trying to fix is interoperability, which brings us perfectly on to how maybe you guys are looking to solve the problem of interoperability. I know inherently or with XCM, you can communicate within the Polkadot ecosystem through their messaging service. How are you trying to maybe interoperate with other ecosystems or other sort of independent layer ones?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and like I think that the landscape, in my view, is going to continue to be fairly complex and like fragmented for the foreseeable future. And so, but I'd start with what you mentioned first, right? So there are these, projects that have been working on interoperability for a long time. I would highlight definitely the two that you mentioned, Cosmos and Polkadot, as being, kind of the OGs. And they have built into building a chain in either environment is this kind of like native messaging capability, cross-chain messaging capability, which is secure, like it has like a very high degree of security. And so I continue to see that there'll be these two, let's call it like almost lands, or these two like kind of networked like kind of ecosystems within Cosmos and Polkadot that will like continue to be around for a long time. Now I think the challenge, if you're just be practical, right? So you're a developer, you come in, you're building an app, you choose to build in one of those two environments. I mean, the challenge is that like most like users, activity, assets, other things are not in those two ecosystems. So then what do you do? And so I think that this has led to the rise of a number of different like cross-chain integration protocols. There's a bunch of them that are deployed to Moonbeam. To name a few that like are getting traction these days. In particular, I think the ones that are most interesting to me are these general message passing protocols. So it's one thing to bridge an asset from one chain to another. That's a problem that's been kind of worked on for some time by a number of different teams. But now it's being kind of genericized into this like general message passing capability where you can transfer an asset or just send a message. And so some of the the teams that are getting traction on Moonbeam these days are folks like Axelar, Layer Zero, Wormhole has a strong presence on Moonbeam. Hyperlane, there's a team called dBridge. So there's a number of kind of new entrants that are attacking this problem in various ways. So we're starting to see I think last year, a lot of the stuff came out for the first time, was released like to production, like last year in 2022. And so developers have just started like taking this new canvas and starting to like paint on it like different ways. And so in the first half of 23 here is when like the first like protocols that have been, worked on that use these new techniques are really coming to market. And I can give some examples of some scenarios we're seeing. One example, well, let's just take like some scenarios that are unique to Moonbeam. So there definitely are like some interesting like asset movement scenarios that are being powered like with these new techniques. And so to give you a sense of the complexity involved, one scenario, let's like take a scenario that like moves from Polkadot ecosystem out. So like there's a collab that we've done, or an integration we've done with the team at Osmosis. Osmosis is probably the kind of the Cosmos chain with the most activity on it these days. It's DEX plus a lot more. And so what they wanted to do was to be able to offer DOT like as like a something that people could like LP into, like if there was pools like on Osmosis. And so the way that the flow looks is that as a user, you say, hey, I want to LP like DOT. You get a native DOT address as your deposit address. So that it goes like on, to the relay chain, like of Polkadot. From there, it gets XEM transferred to Moonbeam to be like what we call XE DOT. From there, it's forwarded to like Axelar, so then it uses Axelar to transit to like the Cosmos interchain. And then there's like an IBC leg that like moves it to Osmosis. And then there's like an action to like LP it, right? So there's like all these things kind of happening in the background facilitated by these new interop like protocols. But the thing that is kind of the coolest to me about this scenario is the user doesn't like know that, right? So they just get this like deposit address, and then there's all these things kind of happening behind the scenes. So to me, that's Web 2 like, right? Where like yes, sure, there's all this stuff happening and behind the scenes, but like you're able to kind of present this like simpler user interface to the user. And so that's like a big unlock for me in terms of how this like interop technology can like drive like more users, more adoption, and kind of do things that you can't do today without it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think it's a really hard problem to solve, but there's been so much progression on it. Certainly last year, this is the thing. Throughout all of last year, we were really saying to people, we've never been so bullish on blockchain as a technology or as an industry, because there was so much sort of technological advancement, and the price from a market point of view never really reflected that. So there's this huge disconnect. Crypto, I think, is largely still, in regards to the sort of mass public, very, very speculative, but there's real advancements taking place, and interoperability is one area where we really see a lot of sort of huge steps being taken. And it sounds like Moonbeam are very much at the center of that.
We're just like, we're kind of specializing like functionality in this area, right? So adding a lot of like support. So it's kind of, there's the base EVM, but then it's been extended with all of these like cross-chain like integrations so that you can access those as a developer.
Yeah, we've spoken about and we sort of mentioned that there's quite a lot of layer ones out there. Could you give me maybe some examples of why Moonbeam? Why is Moonbeam unique to perhaps other layer ones out there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I'll give a couple more examples, and so I think that one use case that has definitely been like a net benefit to the growth of the Moonbeam ecosystem has been the fact that it is strategically positioned like as this like Polkadot parachain. And so the use case, that drove, I think, a lot of adoption, early on for Moonbeam, it's been live for about a year now on mainnet, is that it's kind of let's call it like a gateway to Polkadot, right? So like if people want access to DOT, to other assets like on Polkadot, the easiest way for them to get access to those assets is to like deploy to Moonbeam. And so under the hood, what's happening is, we're able to use like XEM, the cross-chain interoperability technologies built into Polkadot. The first feature that was deployed was this thing called XE20. So an XE20 is basically, you can take an asset on Polkadot, be it DOT or from any other parachain that's on there. You can move it to Moonbeam. When it's on Moonbeam, it looks like it's an ERC20. And so that means that people could take existing protocols from Ethereum mainnet or from other places, deploy it to Moonbeam, and then they could have like native support for like Polkadot-based assets and kind of access the users and assets in Polkadot. And so I think that was just a simple, win, and like that led to a lot of deployments, because people said, hey, like if I want to deploy to Polkadot to get access to users and assets there, I can build a parachain, which is using Substrate, and you build a whole chain. Or I can just deploy a smart contract to Moonbeam, which looks just the same as all these other chains I've deployed to. Well, for a lot of teams, especially ones that are already pursuing this multi-chain deployment strategy, that's like a whole lot easier. So I think that that like definitely helped a lot, like in the with the traction, like in adoption of Moonbeam. That of course is above and beyond just the basics of solid, like reliable infrastructure, RPCs that work, good documentation, and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah, for sure. Like I say, there's many benefits with being built on top of Polkadot. Certainly when you're looking to be interoperable, because you kind of have got a lot of security with Polkadot that maybe other chains don't have. So that you're sort of solid from your end. I mean, I'm personally, like I said to you at the start of the interview, a massive fan of Moonbeam and what they're doing. Could we talk about some short-term goals?
Yeah, so I think and obviously this is all like very community led these days, and we're like one voice among many that are figuring out like what the right like paths forward are. I would say that this continued focus on cross chain, that's going to be a theme for for 23 for sure. As I mentioned, there's a number of great teams are deploying, and I'll probably describe like another example in a bit to just illustrate like sort of a different idea of how people are using these cross-chain interoperability techniques. But I would say this kind of focus on governance is another thing. So that is something that is quite unique to like Polkadot ecosystem projects, and Moonbeam is no different, where yes, there's this EVM, but there's also this full on-chain governance system that governs everything on the chain, including upgrades. So like upgrades are kind of managed by governance, where there's like a forkless upgrade system, which has been used to allow Moonbeam to upgrade like a lot of times. I think probably 25 times or something since it launched, quite a few times. So there's going to be definitely a continued focus on that. There's a new governance system called OpenGov that's just been released to Kusama, and that's heading to Polkadot like soon, and that's also headed to both MoonRiver and Moonbeam shortly, which has a bunch of new governance features. You can set up different tracks for different like domains that need to be governed, have different voting rules around them. So this is a big thing, because when you have like an on-chain governance system, it solves a lot of problems, but then it does come with responsibilities, which is that you need like active participation in governance. Otherwise, it could become a security threat, right? If you don't have a lot of participation in your governance like proposals, then like a single like whale or someone can come in and start to like dictate like the way the network should move. And so that it becomes there's a responsibility basically in having these on-chain governance systems. So yeah, I think those are some of the some of the shorter term goals. And I said, why don't I take the opportunity to explain another use case just to illustrate for listeners of yours the kinds of scenarios we're seeing developers come up with these new cross-chain messaging like techniques.
For sure.
So there's another protocol that's launching soon on Moonbeam called Prime Protocol. It's in the DeFi space, and so the way it works is that it kind of, and this is a pattern that we see among a lot of the newer teams, that they're adopting what I'd call a hub and spoke architecture. So the idea is that you have this hub, you have like a master or a brain, let's call it, on Moonbeam. That's where there's a set of contracts that are there on Moonbeam that are managing the system. But then you also have like these remote like contract deployments or branch offices, I like to call them, on a bunch of chains, right? So in case of Prime, it's like Avalanche, Ethereum mainnet, like Polygon, a bunch of other chains. And so the model or the idea is that instead of having separate deployments on each chain, you actually have, it's one system. So it's like, it's all connected together. So that the use case is, let's say that you were on Avalanche. So you could say, okay, and this is a lending and borrowing use case, is like one of the first use cases they're tackling. So you would deposit AVAX on Avalanche. You basically, it's almost like, a local bank. You have like the branch office in your town. So you go, you meet the users where they are. So there's like a local kind of like contract you can interact with to deposit like AVAX into the protocol. A message gets sent back to the hub recording that happened, right? So it's like, okay, like here's this user and here's like the balance that they have in the system. So then you can go to mainnet, let's say, and then you can do something with it, right? So you might be able to mint stable coins or like to take out like a loan in some other asset like on mainnet. And then when that happens, it'll query back to the hub, the brain, and say, like, what can this person borrow? Oh, look, here's like their balance. They have this deposit over on Avalanche, so let them go and do this thing like on mainnet. And so I think it resembles kind of a architecture of a real business, where you might have like an HQ and then you have these branch offices, but they're able to talk to each other. You can meet the users where they want, but you realize even this simple use case, it opens all sorts of interesting possibilities. So, you can not only kind of access and aggregate like, and leverage assets across like all chains, which you can't normally do. So that's like one thing. But yeah, if you think about it, let's say that there's an opportunity you want to get to on a given chain. Normally, you'd have to figure out a bridging strategy, right? You say, okay, let me withdraw it, let me find the right bridge, and you have to pick the right one because you get different versions on the other side. So like, I get the right bridge, and move it over, and let me LP it into a farm. Let's say, with this, you could say instead, what? Let me just deposit like wherever I am, and then I'll take out a loan in the correct asset, like on the remote side. And there's no like bridging or asset transfers that happen like anywhere, right? This is just mediated by these like messages. And so it's a little bit of an involved scenario, but I'm quite confident that this is going to change like the way like cross-chain like scenarios work, because you're cutting out like all of these complicated interior steps of people needing to like figure out bridges, move things, click like many times. You can just offer one experience where you're able to just directly leverage like your assets like into like whatever point like you need them. And that's just one example. This is just like lending and borrowing. We're seeing other examples too with like games, for example, where there's like, there's a game, Exile Racers on Moonbeam. They have a racing game. And so there's a racetrack on Moonbeam, but you realize then that like they have a racetrack that they're building on like on another channel, like, say they have a racetrack on Avalanche. And so you can move your NFT over, you can race on the other track, but it's all one system. So like the stats of like your races can kind of get aggregated back, right? So you can kind of have a single set of like of performance or stats like for how you're doing, regardless of which racetrack you went to. So it's kind of similar idea where by connecting things, I think it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's definitely like you get something more than just having separate like instances of the protocol like that are islands like on each chain.
That's absolutely fascinating. I think finance is really the forefront. But when you look at what blockchain could achieve, it doesn't just stop with finance. I mean, it's going to integrate itself in the same way that with Web 2, we didn't quite understand what people, nobody thought we'd be looking up memes of who knows what and using that as a kind of use case. Blockchain, I'm sure, is going to find weird and wonderful ways to integrate itself into all our lives. And that's really fascinating. I mean, that's not something I've really explored before, just actually using a messaging, I suppose, in regards a messaging service at the core of many things, but instead of actually moving those chains, because bridges have been a real pain point, I feel like. So that would kind of eliminate the risk there, I guess.
I think that, there's probably new risks you trade off for in some sense, because obviously it's just like with computers, once you network them, then there's like network like threats that can come in. But I would say that, for me, the key thing, we talked about it earlier, is around the user experience. And so right now, I think users have to know an awful lot about like the infrastructure they're dealing with. It's like, it would be as if you're like fired up like Uber, then it's like, okay, what server to connect to, what database to use, like what like messaging queue, which cloud provider to use. It's like users don't like even know how to answer those questions, right? Like, and so for me, the key unlock here is to be able to create like a higher level user experience, hide away infrastructural complexity. I think this whole, even the way we talk about it, it's like I'm on mainnet, I'm moving X, Y, and Z to Moonbeam. I think that's going to be like look like a relic in the future, right? People don't really care like what chain they're on, right? It's probably going to be many chains that are servicing them, but you'll have like a single user experience that's responding to whatever your intents are, and then it may use 5 blockchains to get the job done, just like there could be 5 servers on the other end of like your Uber request. But users don't need to know about that, right? So like that's the unlock, and for me, that's like the important part of all this is, right, to be able to provide the infrastructure so that developers can create better user experiences, which I'm quite convinced are what are needed to drive the next like wave of like large adoption into crypto, where you can get beyond like the kind of the DeFi power user, right? That like a lot of people target now. That community is great, but is pretty small relative to the actual numbers of users like that are using Web 2 apps.
Yeah, it's why I've got such a positive outlook. I totally align with everything that you're saying for blockchain. I've pretty much got every single family member that I have, ranging from 13 years of age to 80 years of age, to set up even things like a MetaMask, and they're looking at me as if to say, is this guy from another planet? And I think that really needs to change in order for us to get to where we're going. And I think Moonbeam are going to play a role in that. Could I get your vision? We spoke about some short-term goals. Could I get maybe a long-term? What do you envision Moonbeam becoming. And then maybe I'll also, because you mentioned governance, I think governance is a massively underlooked part of blockchain right now, but it's actually so crucial. You mentioned for security reasons. There's a multitude of other reasons why governance is so important and still really to be explored. And the weird and wonderful ways people are coming up with actually incentivizing people to take part in governance is it's something that fascinates me. That's for sure.
Let's riff on that for a minute, because that is very top of mind, like for me right now. And I mean, I'll just like to digress for a minute. Like that's what's cool about Web3 is like, yeah, if you think about software, you think about security algorithms, then you think about like political science, and like you think about different like ways of governing, you know, different government structure and other things. And so I think one debate that we've been having, you know, myself and some of the other some of my teammates, like, is, you know, there exists like on, you know, in Polkadot this ability to delegate. It's not something that's used a lot though. And so, you know, I think that there's differing visions here where for some, you know, blockchains enable this direct democracy idea, right? Where like individual token holders can go and, you know, and express themselves. I think though, if you look for like a lot of chains, the turnout is not great, right? Because like, you know, you have to, first of all, have a lot of specialized knowledge. You have to care. You have to like, I think for some things, there's a lot of explanation needed as to like what it means for people that isn't there. So there's a lot of content that's missing. And so we were looking around, and like, you know, one ecosystem that always has a lot of participation is in the Cosmos ecosystem. And so we were looking at this, okay, so what is it that they're doing that like gets this participation? And for me, a big part of it is this trick where basically like the default behavior on a Cosmos chain is that you, when you go to stake, which a lot of people do because it's like economically rational to do so, you know, by default, you delegate your voting power to the validator, like, of the network. And that the validators, you know, that's a much smaller, that's, you know, maybe 40, 50, like, you know, validators are on the network, and they're all highly engaged and will vote. So basically, like, you know, in that scenario, I think they've gotten turnout by attaching it into this thing that people are going to do for economic reasons. But then you get the delegation, and then like that's how you're able to get like, you know, much better turnout numbers. I think that, you know, that makes, I think this delegated model, I'm starting to come around to the idea that I think that makes sense. It's always going to be like very difficult to get like end users to like understand and care and turn out. It's probably much better to have them vote for someone who they think can represent their beliefs, kind of like, you know, like the American system is like this, right? Where, you know, obviously you vote for someone who's then going to represent you, like in, you know, in government. So I don't know. These are the kinds of things that, you know, it's cool about Web3. Start to think about like the different models that are possible. And
it's fascinating, isn't it? I think there has to be an economic incentive. You have to be incentivized to vote. I almost feel like otherwise people just won't. I know Algorand, actually, if you wanted certainly a significantly higher staking reward, they incentivized you to take part in their governance, because they dropped the staking reward that was just for everybody who was, you know, whether you had it on a centralized exchange or whether you were doing it from one of their wallets, and actually really up the staking rewards for people who were taking part in the governance. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think the party model, if I can call it that, you know, the party being referenced to the validators is kind of, you know, in the UK, we've got Conservative, Labour or whatever it is. That's probably makes a lot of sense to me. It's something that I've never really spent a great amount of time thinking about in terms of how to solve it, but it's certainly an area that is greatly of great interest.
Yeah, I've seen other ideas too, where like, you know, I think that I've seen one idea where people, you know, there could be a lottery, right? So if you directly participate, maybe your name is entered in a lottery, and then like you might win the grand prize. Like, so that might, you know, economically incentivize people. But, you know, it is weird when you apply incentives, they're very powerful, right? So like if you just start incentivizing people to participate in governance, you kind of, in the end, I don't know that you get what you wanted, or you don't get like an engaged citizenry. You just get people that just do it, like, and they're also like not really engaged or thinking about it. They just do it because it's like, you know, in their economic interest. So, but yeah, I think this, you know, this party model could work, but you realize now that there's not really the equivalent of like political parties right now, like in most blockchains, and there's not even really platforms upon which people could like differentiate themselves or say, hey, I stand for this, this, and this, and that you should vote for me. And so I expect that to happen, though. I expect to see that, like, you know, as these governance systems evolve, that there probably will be something that resembles more like regular politics that we're used to, you know, with different parties, different kinds of camps. You know,
that's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I also think the blockchain, one place it is going to end up is in sort of government voting, you know. So it's really, really interesting. You could have almost like these coalitions of people that form, and it's such an early space to be a part of. The possibilities of where it's going and you know, the direction it's going to take, I think are really fascinating for me. So what would you say the sort of long-term vision for Moonbeam is? You know, what do you envision in the future your role is going to be, and how it's going to turn out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that in terms of what, you know, what my hopes are for Moonbeam in the future are, you know, in this world where there's a lot of different blockchains and a lot of different ways of connecting those blockchains via these different like messaging systems, you know, I think that like what my hope would be for Moonbeam to play like a really good and key supporting role in facilitating those interactions. So kind of like you know, even when you had the internet, you had certain key points that were like where there was a lot of like message routing like happening. For example, right, in the US there was a particular place in Virginia where like a lot of the internet traffic like routed through this place in Virginia, and it was called May East, and that, you know, I think that's the kind of thing I envision as like these networks develop, this communications develop. You know, my hope is that that Moonbeam can play a role in helping facilitate a lot of those interactions. Then you know, by virtue of that, help like, you know, help Web3 grow, help provide, you know, great infrastructure, and like help, you know, with the UX, as I mentioned before. But it's really around facilitating these cross-chain interactions. That's where I see, you know, the like that's the main contribution I can see Moonbeam really providing to the Web3 space.
And I think that's a massive contribution. Derek, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. You know, I've learned a hell of a lot from this. It's been a sort of goal of mine to interview you as well. So I'm super honored that you've taken the time to come out and not only speak to me, but my audience. And I'm sure it's been greatly appreciated. I'm going to leave a link to where they can find yourself on social media. Also, everything to do with Moonbeam, where you can find them if you want to explore MoonRiver and the sort of kusama side of things. We'll leave links to where you can find all that in the description. Thank you very much, Derek. It's been an absolute pleasure, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you.